When you have been lied about for a series of years, how hurtful that is.
People think her kids are fake. They think they're AI.
Breaking news from the palace walls. And I need you to brace yourself for this one. Because what you're about to hear isn't just another royal scandal. This is something that strikes at the very foundation of the monarchy itself. Something that, if proven true, doesn't just damage reputations, it threatens the entire line of succession. They called her the modern Cinderella. Meghan Markle, the biracial American actress who captured a prince's heart and became a duchess. The woman who supposedly stumbled into a fairy tale. But what if she didn't stumble at all? What if every step was calculated, engineered, polished to perfection, and then sold to the world? Camera ready? From Hollywood ambition to royal rebellion, Meghan mastered the art of self-production. She knew how to craft narratives, control her image, and present exactly the version of herself that would open the right doors. Until her own sister, Samantha Markle, pulled back the curtain. Can you imagine this? Your own flesh.
Meghan, a geriatric mother. The family claims and states that Meghan had a hysterectomy. How can a woman with a hysterectomy be pregnant? And most of all, why did the family, royal family, go along with this? And what's going to happen now that this has come out? This is a punishable crime. This is fraud in the highest level.
And blood, the person who watched you grow up, who knows the truth behind every carefully constructed story you've told, deciding that enough is enough. That the lies,
I'm going to quote Tom Bauer, by saying, he said, look, we all laughed.
Lies have gone too far. That the world deserves to know what she knows. Samantha had stayed quiet for years, watching Meghan's rise from supporting actress on a cable
In my opinion, she would still be a waitress if it wasn't for Dad.
TV show to Duchess of Sussex. But when the family she knew, the real Meghan behind the PR machine, vanished behind palace walls and a new, sanitized version emerged, silence turned into suspicion.
You said has come true.
And there's a very big difference. It was deliberate.
And then into something far more explosive. Her cryptic warning came first. People need to look at the timeline. Just that. Simple words that cracked open a conspiracy spiraling far beyond sibling rivalry. Because when people actually looked at the timeline, really looked, with forensic attention to dates and photos and public appearances, things didn't add up. The internet dug deep. And the timelines didn't line up. Bump photos that seemed to bend reality. Births that lacked witnesses. Hospital visits that couldn't be verified. And whispers about surrogacy that turned into full-blown scandal when someone came forward with claims that would shake the monarchy to its core. Then came DL, a mysterious woman claiming to be the real biological mother of Meghan's royal children. Not just making vague accusations, but bringing receipts, clinic logs, coded payments, emails buried under secrecy clauses. Her words were quiet but nuclear. If I'm lying, I'll take a DNA test on live TV. The palace stayed silent. And that silence roared louder than any denial could have. Because here's what makes this different from every other royal scandal. This isn't about affairs or bad behavior or family drama. This is about legitimacy. This is about whether the children in the line of succession are actually who they are claimed to be. And according to centuries-old constitutional law, royal heirs must be born of the body. Not adopted. Not born via surrogate. Born of the body. If DL's claims hold weight, if Samantha's timeline investigations reveal what sources say they reveal, then it's not just Meghan's reputation on the line. It's the crown itself. Can you imagine being Harry right now? Finding out that everything you thought about your children's birth might be a carefully orchestrated deception? That the woman you trusted most in the world may have been lying about the most fundamental fact of your family? Through it all, Samantha didn't rage. She didn't scream or throw tantrums or make wild accusations without evidence. She calculated. She documented. She waited. Her interviews became confessions wrapped in riddles, breadcrumbs leading investigators toward truths she couldn't quite say outright without legal consequences. Until she dropped the line that burned through Buckingham Palace like wildfire. Regret? Only if the truth stops being the truth. Now, the fairy tale lies in ruins. A duchess accused of the most profound deception imaginable. A sister vindicated, or vengeful, depending on who you ask. A monarchy trembling under rumors that threaten its very legitimacy. Whether Samantha's story is revelation or revenge, one truth remains. Once a royal illusion shatters, there's no putting the glass slipper back together. Tonight, we're going to examine every piece of evidence. Every timeline inconsistency. Every suspicious detail that Samantha wants the world to see. Every claim from the woman calling herself DL. And every reason why the palace's silence might be the loudest confession of all. So before we dive into the hysterectomy claims, the surrogacy evidence, and the constitutional crisis brewing beneath the surface, I need you to ask yourself, what if everything we were told about Archie and Lilibet's births was a performance? What would that mean for the monarchy? For Harry? For the children themselves? Because by the end of this investigation, you're going to have to decide what you believe. And neither answer is comfortable. Let's begin where Samantha's story starts, with a sister who watched Meghan transform from an ambitious actress into someone she no longer recognized. Samantha Markle has been painted by the media as many things: bitter, jealous, estranged, desperate for attention. Meghan's PR machine worked overtime to ensure the world saw Samantha as an unreliable narrator driven by envy of her half-sister's success. But here's what nobody talks about. Samantha knew Meghan before the reinvention. Before the carefully curated image. Before the strategic narrative construction that would eventually land her a prince. She knew the real Meghan. The one who didn't match the polished version the world fell in love with. And for years, she watched that person disappear behind layers of PR, media training, and what Samantha describes as a carefully constructed fiction designed to make her seem like the perfect modern princess. Can you imagine being in Samantha's position? You have a half-sister. You watched her grow up, at least from a distance. You know things about her childhood, her personality, her ambitions, her methods. You know the gap between who she actually is and who she pretends to be. And then she marries into the royal family and starts telling the world stories that you know aren't quite true. Stories about growing up struggling financially when her father actually spent hundreds of thousands on her private school education. Stories about being self-made when she had industry connections through her father's career. Stories about family dynamics that don't match what you remember. What do you do with that knowledge? Do you stay quiet to protect family privacy? Or do you speak up because the lies have become too big to ignore? Samantha chose silence. For a long time. She watched Meghan's wedding. She saw the global spectacle, the billions of viewers, the fairy tale narrative being sold to the world. And she stayed quiet. She watched the pregnancy announcements, the carefully staged photos, the controlled media appearances. And she stayed quiet. But according to sources close to Samantha, something shifted when Meghan started actively rewriting family history in public interviews. When she began portraying herself as essentially estranged from the Markle side of the family her entire life, when Samantha knew that wasn't true. When Meghan told Oprah that she'd grown up as an only child, erasing Samantha and her brother from her personal history entirely, something broke. Because that wasn't just spin. That wasn't just strategic narrative shaping. That was erasure. That was Meghan pretending her siblings simply didn't exist because they didn't fit the story she wanted to tell. That's when Samantha started asking questions publicly. Not wild accusations. Not tabloid gossip. But questions. Why does the timeline of the pregnancy not quite match the photos? Why were there no traditional witnesses at the births? Why do some photos show a bump that moves or changes size in ways that don't match natural pregnancy progression? And most cryptically, people need to look at the timeline. Can you imagine how calculated that statement was? She didn't say Meghan faked her pregnancies. She didn't make specific accusations that could be easily dismissed or sued over. She simply suggested that people look closely at the timeline. And when people did, they found inconsistencies. Small things at first. A bump that appeared suddenly between appearances just days apart. Photos where the size and position of the bump seemed inconsistent with the stated pregnancy timeline. Public appearances where Meghan's movements seemed unencumbered by late-stage pregnancy in ways that seemed unusual. None of it was proof of anything. But all of it was strange enough to make people wonder. Samantha knew what she was doing. She was planting seeds. Letting the public do the detective work. Avoiding making claims so specific that Meghan's lawyers could come after her, while still directing attention to the evidence that was already public. Because here's what sources say Samantha understood. She didn't need to prove anything herself. She just needed to get people looking in the right direction. And once they started looking, they'd see what she saw. The photos that didn't quite add up. The timeline gaps that couldn't be easily explained. The hospital visit that seemed to happen differently than royal births traditionally do. The christening photos that looked oddly staged. But Samantha's real weapon wasn't the evidence she could point to. It was the knowledge she had from growing up in the same family. Knowledge about Meghan's relationship with truth, with image management, with saying whatever needed to be said to create the desired perception. And if Meghan was willing to erase her own siblings from her life story when it suited her narrative, What else might she be willing to misrepresent? Let me ask you, if your sibling became famous and started telling stories about your shared family that you knew weren't accurate, would you speak up? Or would you stay quiet to avoid being called jealous or bitter? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because Samantha made a choice, and that choice has led us to this moment where the entire royal legitimacy might be in question. Now, we need to look at the specific evidence Samantha wants people to see. The timeline inconsistencies. The photographic anomalies. The hospital visit discrepancies. Because this isn't just about sibling rivalry anymore. This is about whether the world was sold a completely fabricated story about how Archie and Lilibet came into the world. When we come back, we're diving deep into the pregnancy timelines. The photos that launched 1,000 conspiracy theories. And the medical claims that may have just blown this entire story wide open. Stay with us. This is just getting started. People need to look at the timeline. That's all Samantha said. But it was enough. Because once people started looking, really looking, with forensic attention, the cracks became impossible to ignore. Let's start with Archie's pregnancy announcement. October 2018, during the Australian tour. Meghan and Harry announced they were expecting their first child. Standard royal pregnancy announcement, right? Except for one detail that immediately struck royal watchers as odd. The timing. Meghan had just gotten married in May 2018. By October, she would have been, at most, 12 weeks pregnant. Most royal women wait until after the 12-week mark to announce, when the risk of miscarriage drops significantly. But more than that, the announcement came on the exact day of Princess Eugenie's wedding. The day that was supposed to celebrate Eugenie, Meghan announced her pregnancy, effectively stealing the spotlight. Can you imagine being Eugenie? Your wedding day, one of the most important days of your life, and your new sister-in-law announces her pregnancy, ensuring that all the press coverage and public attention shifts to her instead of you? That wasn't an accident. That was strategy. And it was the first sign that something about this pregnancy was going to be different. But the real anomalies started appearing in the photographic record. Throughout the pregnancy, royal watchers began noticing something strange. Meghan's bumps seemed inconsistent. Not in the normal way where pregnancy bumps grow gradually over time, but inconsistent in ways that didn't make medical sense. There were photos taken just days apart where the bump appeared to be completely different sizes. Appearances where the bump seemed high, then low, then high again in a sequence that didn't match normal pregnancy progression. And then there were the infamous photos where the bump appeared to move, shift. In one particularly viral moment during a public appearance, Meghan bent over and the bump appeared to collapse or fold in a way that human bodies don't naturally do. Now, Meghan's supporters explained this away as clothing, angles, and conspiracy theorists seeing what they wanted to see. And some of that is probably fair. Photography can be deceiving. Angles matter. Clothing can create optical illusions. But here's what couldn't be explained away. The timeline of public appearances versus the stated pregnancy timeline didn't match the visual evidence. If Meghan announced in October 2018 at 12 weeks, she would have been due around May 2019. Archie was reportedly born May 6, 2019. That math works. But when you look at photos from March and April 2019, when Meghan should have been very visibly in her third trimester, the bump size varies wildly between appearances. Sometimes looking full-term. Sometimes looking more like mid-second trimester. And then there's the way Meghan moved. Royal watchers who'd followed Catherine through 3 pregnancies noted that in late pregnancy, there's a distinctive way women walk, bend, and carry themselves. The weight distribution changes. Movement becomes more cautious. But in videos from what should have been Meghan's final weeks of pregnancy, she's bending easily, moving quickly, showing none of the physical limitations that typically accompany late-stage pregnancy. Again, every single one of these observations can be explained individually. But when you put them all together, when you look at the full timeline Samantha was pointing to, a pattern emerges that makes people ask uncomfortable questions. Then came the birth itself. And this is where things get truly strange. Royal births traditionally follow a protocol. The baby is born at a hospital, usually the Lindo wing where royal births have happened for generations. There's a formal announcement. Doctors sign documentation. Photographers gather outside to capture the new parents presenting the baby. None of that happened with Archie. Instead, the announcement came hours after the reported birth, with Harry appearing alone to tell the world he had a son. No doctors. No medical staff verification. No immediate photos. When Meghan did appear with the baby 2 days later, it was in a carefully controlled photo op at Windsor Castle. Not the traditional hospital steps presentation. A private, managed appearance where every detail was controlled. Can you imagine how unusual this was? For centuries, royal births have followed a pattern. Public. Verified. Witnessed by medical professionals whose names are recorded. Traditional. Meghan broke all of it. And when questioned about why, the answer was always modernizing the monarchy or privacy. But here's what Samantha wants people to consider. What if it wasn't about privacy? What if traditional royal birth protocols were avoided because they would have revealed something that needed to stay hidden? What if there was no hospital birth to photograph because there was no hospital birth at all? Now, before anyone dismisses this as conspiracy theory, let's look at what happened with Lilibet's birth just 2 years later. Lilibet was reportedly born in California in June 2021. Even further from traditional royal protocol, since it happened in America with no royal medical staff present. But here's where it gets interesting. According to sources, Meghan's own lawyer stated in legal documents related to a different case that Meghan had undergone a hysterectomy before Lilibet's birth. A hysterectomy. The surgical removal of the uterus. A procedure that makes natural pregnancy literally impossible. If that legal document is accurate, and Samantha claims it is, then Lilibet could not have been naturally born to Meghan. Not medically possible. Which would mean either the legal document was wrong, or the birth story was. Let me ask you, if you were Samantha, and you saw this legal document, what would you do? Would you stay quiet because it's not your business? Or would you feel obligated to point out that something doesn't add up? Drop your thoughts below. Because we're about to enter even more controversial territory. When we come back, we're going to talk about DL, the mysterious woman who claims to be the biological mother of Meghan's children. Who she is, what evidence she's brought forward, and why the palace's silence on her claims might be the most damning response of all. This is where the story goes from suspicious timeline to constitutional crisis. Stay with us. For months, royal watchers had been analyzing photos, questioning timelines, and debating whether Meghan's pregnancies looked authentic. It was all speculation, internet theories, and circumstantial observations. Until DL came forward. We don't know her full name, she's protected her identity for obvious legal and safety reasons. But the woman identified as DL stepped into the public conversation with claims so explosive that if proven true, they would invalidate the Sussex children's place in the royal succession entirely. DL claims she is the biological mother of Archie and Lilibet. Not the gestational carrier. Not an adoption connection. The biological mother who was allegedly paid through a surrogacy arrangement to carry Meghan and Harry's children. Can you imagine the weight of that claim? We're not talking about speculation anymore. We're talking about someone saying I gave birth to those children, and I can prove it. And here's what made DL's claims impossible to dismiss outright. She brought receipts. Clinic logs showing her name and dates that allegedly correspond to the conception timeline for both Archie and Lilibet. Coded payments from shell companies that sources traced back to entities with connections to the Sussexes' financial structure. Emails, heavily redacted to protect identities, that discuss the arrangement, compensation schedules, and confidentiality requirements. Now, none of this has been independently verified by major media outlets, which is why they've been careful about reporting on it. But the documentation DL has shared with certain investigators and online communities is detailed enough that it can't be dismissed as easily as random conspiracy theory. She's not just making vague claims. She's providing specific dates, locations, payment amounts, medical facility names. Details that would be extraordinarily risky to fabricate because they could be fact-checked and disproven. And then she said something that made the entire situation even more volatile. If I'm lying, I'll take a DNA test on live TV. Think about that for a moment. Someone claiming to be the biological mother of children in the royal line of succession is volunteering to prove it through DNA testing in a public forum. That's not the behavior of someone making things up. That's either someone telling the truth or someone with an extraordinarily sophisticated and risky deception. Sources say DL has repeatedly tried to reach out through legal channels to formalize DNA testing, but has been met with silence. No response from Meghan's lawyers. No response from royal legal representatives. Just nothing. And that silence is deafening. Because if DL's claims were completely fabricated, the easiest thing in the world would be to disprove them. DNA test. Results released. Claims demolished. DL discredited. But that's not happening. Instead, there's absolute silence from everyone who could definitively prove or disprove her story. Now let's talk about why this matters beyond just scandal and gossip. Because this isn't about Meghan's reputation or Harry's judgment or family drama. This is about constitutional law. The British line of succession has specific requirements that have been in place for centuries. One of the most fundamental requirements is that royal heirs must be born of the body of their royal parent. Not adopted. Not born through surrogacy. Born of the body. This isn't arbitrary. It's rooted in the need for absolute certainty about bloodline legitimacy. The monarchy's entire authority rests on legitimate succession. On the clear, unbroken line from one monarch to the next through biological descent. If Archie and Lilibet were born via surrogate, even if using Meghan and Harry's genetic material, they technically do not qualify for the line of succession under traditional constitutional interpretation. Can you imagine the implications? Two children who the world believes are in line to the British throne potentially not having any legitimate claim to that position. This isn't about whether surrogacy is moral or ethical or should be accepted. It's about whether it's legally compatible with centuries of constitutional precedent. And sources say this is exactly what has the palace in panic mode behind closed doors. Because if DL's claims are true, they face an impossible choice. Acknowledge the surrogacy and remove the Sussex children from the line of succession, validating every conspiracy theory and making Meghan and Harry look like they perpetrated a massive fraud on the British public and the institution. Or stay silent, maintain the official story, and hope that DL's evidence never becomes so overwhelming that independent verification becomes unavoidable. Right now, they are choosing silence. But silence only works as long as the evidence stays in the realm of online discussion and isn't forced into a legal or official setting. And that's where Samantha comes back into the story. Because Samantha isn't just pointing at timelines anymore. She's pointing at DL. She's saying, look at what this woman is claiming. Look at the evidence she has. Don't you think someone should investigate? Unless you couldn't. Comment below what you think is really happening here. Because we're about to examine the medical evidence that Samantha says makes natural pregnancy impossible for Meghan. The hysterectomy claims. The legal documents. The medical timeline that allegedly proves DL might be telling the truth. When we come back, we're diving into the evidence that's making the palace's silence look less like dignified restraint and more like desperate self-preservation. Stay with us. Here's where Samantha's investigation becomes impossible to ignore. Because everything up until now could theoretically be explained away as coincidence, photography tricks, or privacy choices. But medical impossibility? That's different. According to sources close to legal proceedings unrelated to the surrogacy claims, documents were filed in a separate lawsuit that mentioned Meghan having undergone a hysterectomy. A hysterectomy. The surgical removal of the uterus. Now, this reference was allegedly brief, mentioned in passing as part of a different legal matter. The kind of detail that might slip by unless someone was specifically looking for it. But Samantha was looking. And when she saw it, she understood immediately what it meant for the timeline of Meghan's claimed pregnancies. Can you imagine being Samantha in that moment? Reading a legal document that potentially proves everything you suspected? That your sister's entire motherhood narrative was constructed fiction? Because here's the medical reality. If you've had a hysterectomy, you cannot get pregnant naturally. Period. It's not a question of difficulty or health concerns or needing medical intervention. It's biological impossibility. No uterus means no pregnancy. So if Meghan had a hysterectomy before Lilibet's birth in 2021, then Lilibet was not naturally born to her. Not carried by her. Not biologically gestated in her body. Which would mean the pregnancy photos, the birth announcement, the entire story sold to the world about Lilibet's arrival, all of it would be fabrication. Now, Meghan's defenders would argue that if this hysterectomy claim is real, maybe it happened after Lilibet was born. That the timeline isn't what Samantha suggests. But here's the problem with that defense. The legal document that allegedly mentions the hysterectomy was filed in a case involving events before Lilibet's birth. The timeline in the document doesn't work if the procedure happened after June 2021. Sources familiar with the legal filings say the hysterectomy reference was in the context of explaining Meghan's medical status during a specific time period, and that time period was before Lilibet's reported birth date. If accurate, this one document demolishes the official narrative completely. But let's take a step back and look at the bigger medical picture. Because the hysterectomy claim isn't the only medical evidence that raises questions. Throughout both pregnancies, there were observers who noted that Meghan never seemed to display typical pregnancy symptoms in public. No visible swelling in hands and feet. No changes to her face that typically accompany third trimester water retention. No apparent discomfort in positions that would normally be uncomfortable for heavily pregnant women. Her skin appeared flawless throughout. No melasma, no acne changes, none of the common skin reactions to pregnancy hormones. She moved with ease and agility right up until the reported birth dates. Bending, walking quickly, wearing high heels, showing none of the physical limitations that typically affect women in late pregnancy. Now again, every woman's pregnancy is different. Some women have textbook pregnancies with every symptom. Others have remarkably easy pregnancies with minimal discomfort. But when you combine the unusual lack of typical pregnancy signs with the timeline inconsistencies, the photographic anomalies, DL's claims, and now this alleged hysterectomy reference, the pattern becomes harder to explain away as just every pregnancy is different. It starts to look like maybe there was no pregnancy at all. At least not in Meghan's body. Can you imagine the level of deception that would require? The daily maintenance of a fake bump. The careful management of every photo angle. The coordination required to ensure no slip-ups, no moments where the truth became visible. And for what? Why would someone go to such extraordinary lengths? Sources close to the situation suggest several possible motivations. 1. Medical necessity. If Meghan couldn't carry a pregnancy for legitimate health reasons, surrogacy would be understandable. But why not just be honest about it? 2. Royal requirements. The born-of-the-body constitutional requirement might have made them feel they had to hide surrogacy to protect the children's place in succession. 3. Image management. Meghan's brand was partly built on being the modern, relatable royal. Pregnancy and motherhood were key parts of that image. Surrogacy might have seemed too controversial or complicated for the narrative she wanted to project. 4. Control. By controlling every aspect of the pregnancy and birth narrative, Meghan maintained total control over her image without hospital witnesses, medical documentation, or traditional protocols that might reveal information she didn't want public. Whatever the motivation, if the hysterectomy claim is accurate, it means one of the most public pregnancy stories in modern history was completely fabricated. And the palace knew. They must have known. Royal protection officers, palace officials, medical staff, someone would have been aware of the real situation. Which means the silence isn't just about avoiding scandal. It's about protecting an elaborate deception that goes far beyond Meghan and Harry. It implicates the institution itself in maintaining a lie about the legitimate line of succession. Let me ask you, if you discovered that a major public figure had faked a pregnancy using elaborate prosthetics and carefully staged photos, would you think that was just a privacy choice? Or would you see it as a fundamental deception of public trust? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because we're about to look at why this matters not just for gossip reasons, but for actual constitutional and legal reasons that affect the entire monarchy. When we come back, we're examining what the law actually says about surrogacy and royal succession. Why the palace can't just admit the truth even if they wanted to. And why Samantha's exposure of this might force a reckoning the monarchy desperately wants to avoid. This is where scandal becomes constitutional crisis. Stay with us. Let's talk about why this matters in ways that go far beyond celebrity gossip or family drama. Because if everything Samantha Markle and DL are suggesting is true, if Archie and Lilibet were born via surrogate using Meghan and Harry's genetic material but not carried by Meghan herself, we're not just talking about a scandal. We're talking about a constitutional crisis that strikes at the very heart of how monarchy works. The British line of succession isn't just a list of names that can be adjusted based on modern sensibilities. It's governed by centuries of law, precedent, and constitutional requirement. And one of the most fundamental requirements is that heirs to the throne must be born of the body of their royal parent. This language appears repeatedly in historical royal documents. It's not accidental. It's not symbolic. It's literal and legally binding. Born of the body means naturally gestated and delivered by the royal parent. Not adopted. Not created through modern reproductive technology that didn't exist when these laws were written. Born of the body. Can you imagine the legal complexity this creates in the modern world? Because when these laws were written, surrogacy didn't exist. IVF didn't exist. Gestational carriers didn't exist. The laws were designed to ensure absolute certainty about bloodline, that a child claiming royal descent was genuinely biologically descended from the royal parent and had been carried and delivered by that parent, with witnesses to verify the birth. It was the ultimate anti-fraud measure. Because if you require public, witnessed birth from the royal parent's own body, you eliminate any possibility of substitution, fraud, or illegitimate claims to the throne. Now, should those laws be updated for the modern world? That's a legitimate question for Parliament and constitutional scholars to debate. But here's the problem. They haven't been updated. The old requirements still technically stand. Which means if Archie and Lilibet were born via surrogate, they technically don't qualify for the succession under traditional constitutional interpretation. And sources say this is exactly why the palace is maintaining absolute silence about DL's claims and the surrogacy allegations. because acknowledging the truth would force them to confront this constitutional nightmare. They can't just say, yes, surrogacy was used, but the children are genetically Harry and Meghan's, so it's fine. That's not how the law works. They would have to either: Option A, remove Archie and Lilibet from the line of succession, admitting that centuries-old constitutional requirements still apply and haven't been overridden by modern reproductive technology. Option B, keep them in the succession and argue that born of the body should be interpreted to include genetic parenthood regardless of who carried the pregnancy, effectively rewriting constitutional law without parliamentary approval. Option C, admit nothing, maintain the official story, and hope the evidence never becomes so overwhelming that legal action forces their hand. Right now, they are choosing option C, silence. Denial through omission. Hoping that if they simply don't acknowledge the claims, they can't be forced to address the constitutional implications. But here's what they didn't count on: Samantha Markle's persistence. And DL's willingness to push for DNA verification. Because as long as this stays in the realm of internet speculation, the palace can ignore it. But if it ever enters a legal setting, if DL files formal petitions, if DNA testing gets court-ordered, if Samantha's legal challenges gain traction, the palace will be forced to respond. And any response they give will be devastating. Either they admit the surrogacy and face the constitutional crisis, or they deny it and risk perjury or contempt if evidence later proves they lied. Can you imagine being in the royal legal team right now? Trying to figure out how to navigate a situation where every possible option is terrible? Now let's talk about Harry's position in all this. Because if these claims are true, Harry is in an impossible situation. Either he knew about the surrogacy from the beginning, which makes him complicit in deceiving the public and the institution about his children's legitimate claim to the succession. Or he didn't know, which means Meghan deceived him too, faking pregnancies and letting him believe he witnessed the natural births of his children when actually someone else carried them. Both scenarios are devastating. But sources close to the situation suggest that Harry may genuinely not have known the full extent of what was happening. Remember everything we discussed in previous investigations about Harry's vulnerabilities? The 25-year drug addiction, the intellectual limitations, the emotional manipulation he was allegedly subject to. If Meghan could convince him that his own family was racist and trying to control him, if she could rewrite his entire worldview and turn him against everyone who'd protected him his whole life, convincing him that pregnancies were real when they weren't would be relatively simple. Especially if she carefully controlled what he saw, when he saw it, and what explanations he was given for any inconsistencies he noticed. Harry might be a victim in this too. Just another person deceived by someone who understood how to manipulate his vulnerabilities. Let me ask you, if you were Harry, and you discovered years later that your children weren't born the way you thought they were, that the entire story you'd been told was fiction, what would you do? Would you admit the truth publicly and face the consequences? Or would you maintain the lie to protect your children and your own reputation? Comment below. Because Harry may be facing exactly that impossible choice right now. Now we're heading into the final chapter where we look at what happens next. Because this story isn't over. The evidence keeps mounting. The pressure keeps building. And eventually, something has to give. Whether it's Samantha forcing legal action, DL pushing for DNA testing, or the palace finally deciding that maintaining the lie is more damaging than admitting the truth. Stay with us for the conclusion. We've reached the end of our investigation into Samantha Markle's explosive claims. But this isn't really an ending, is it? Because the story is still unfolding. The evidence is still mounting. And the palace's silence is becoming harder to maintain as more people ask uncomfortable questions. Let's recap where we are. Samantha Markle, the sister who knew Meghan before the reinvention, has been methodically pointing to timeline inconsistencies in both pregnancies. DL, a woman claiming to be the biological mother of Archie and Lilibet, has come forward with documentation suggesting she was the surrogate carrier, and she's willing to prove it through DNA testing. Legal documents have allegedly surfaced mentioning a hysterectomy, which if accurately dated, would make natural pregnancy impossible for Meghan. Photographic evidence shows anomalies in bump appearance and progression that don't match typical pregnancy presentation. And the palace has maintained absolute silence on all of it, refusing to confirm or deny any of the claims. Can you imagine what it's like inside Buckingham Palace right now? The emergency meetings, the legal consultations, the constitutional experts being brought in to advise on what happens if this blows up publicly. Because here's what they understand that the public doesn't fully grasp yet: this isn't containable anymore. The evidence is out there. The questions are being asked. The timeline analysis has been done by thousands of people independently reaching similar conclusions. You can't put this particular genie back in the bottle. The glass slipper, to use the fairy tale metaphor, has shattered. And no amount of palace PR can glue it back together. So what happens next? Sources say there are several possible outcomes, none of them good for the Sussexes or the monarchy. Scenario 1. DL pushes for legal action and court-ordered DNA testing. If she succeeds, and if the results show she is biologically related to Archie and Lilibet, the constitutional crisis becomes unavoidable. The palace will be forced to address the succession question directly. Scenario 2. Samantha's legal challenges against Meghan, currently ongoing for defamation, expand to include questions about the pregnancy deception. Discovery in those cases could force revelation of medical records or other documentation that proves or disproves the surrogacy claims. Scenario 3. Someone from inside the medical establishment, a doctor, nurse, or administrative staff who was involved in whatever actually happened, decides to come forward with first-hand testimony. One credible medical professional could blow this wide open. Scenario 4. Harry himself, in a moment of clarity or conscience, decides to tell the truth. Whether that's admitting he was deceived or admitting he was complicit, his testimony would be impossible for the palace to contradict. Scenario 5. The palace decides that maintaining the lie has become more damaging than admitting the truth, and they quietly remove Archie and Lilibet from the line of succession with some carefully worded statement about modern family structures and constitutional requirements. Any of these scenarios could happen. And sources suggest that behind closed doors, the palace is preparing for all of them. But here's what makes this situation uniquely tragic. The real victims in all of this are Archie and Lilibet themselves. Whether they were born via surrogate or not, whether they legally qualify for the succession or not, they are innocent children who didn't ask to be born into this mess. If the truth comes out, that their births were staged, that their place in the royal family was never legitimate, that their mother orchestrated an elaborate deception involving their very existence, what does that do to them? How do you grow up knowing you were the center of a scandal that rocked the monarchy? How do you process that your mother potentially faked carrying you? How do you reconcile your identity when the story of how you came into the world was a performance? Can you imagine being those children in 10 or 15 years, old enough to understand, and discovering all of this? The trauma that could create is unthinkable. And that's what makes Samantha's decision to expose this so controversial. Because yes, she might be revealing truth. Yes, she might be holding Meghan accountable for deception. Yes, she might be protecting constitutional integrity. But she's also potentially destroying the emotional foundation of her niece and nephew's entire identity. Is that justified? That's for each person to decide for themselves. Through it all, Samantha hasn't raged. She hasn't screamed. She hasn't made wild, unsubstantiated accusations. She's calculated. She's documented. She's pointed to evidence and said, look at this. Think about this. Draw your own conclusions. Her interviews have become confessions wrapped in riddles, breadcrumbs leading investigators toward truths she can't quite say outright without facing legal consequences. Until she dropped the line that may define this entire scandal. Regret? Only if the truth stops being the truth. Think about that statement. It's not I regret nothing. It's not I stand by everything I've said. It's I'll only regret this if what I'm saying isn't actually true. Which implies absolute confidence that her claims are accurate. That the evidence she's pointing to is real. That the timeline inconsistencies aren't explained by photography tricks or privacy choices. Now, the fairy tale lies in ruins. A duchess accused of orchestrating one of the most elaborate deceptions in modern royal history. A sister vindicated, or vengeful, depending on your perspective. A monarchy trembling under the weight of rumors that threaten its very legitimacy. Whether Samantha's story is revelation or revenge, one truth remains. Once a royal illusion shatters, there's no putting the glass slipper back together. The cracks are visible. The questions have been asked. The evidence has been documented. And the palace's silence, that deafening, desperate silence, may be the loudest confession of all. So I'll leave you with the same questions we started with. What do you believe actually happened with Archie and Lilibet's births? Do you think Samantha is exposing truth or manufacturing scandal? And should the monarchy be forced to address these claims directly, or is maintaining the official story the better choice for everyone involved? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this investigation with anyone who needs to see the evidence. And remember that sometimes the most important stories are the ones powerful institutions desperately want to keep buried. Until next time, keep questioning. Keep looking beneath the polished surfaces. Keep demanding accountability from those who claim to deserve our respect and support. Because whether you love or hate Meghan Markle, whether you support or oppose the monarchy, whether you believe Samantha or dismiss her as bitter, everyone deserves to know if the line of succession to the British throne is based on truth or on fiction. And right now, that question remains terrifyingly unanswered.